From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
For the next 45 minutes, you all are in for a real treat. Evan Thomas is one of our country's most accomplished journalists, the former Washington bureau chief and assistant managing editor at Newsweek, and he is also one of the nation's most accomplished authors. For decades, he has done something which I think is rather amazing. He has lived in the moment, describing events in real time with vivid prose, while excavating the past and bringing it to life with depth and lucidity in a whole series of books. As an author, he has written a series of best-selling books, including biographies of Robert Kennedy, Edward Bennett Williams, and John Paul Jones. He's written about the CIA, the war in the Pacific, and the Spanish-American War. He will talk today about his most recent book, Ike's Bluff, President Eisenhower's Secret Battle to Save the World. It is the story of how Eisenhower kept the peace during a perilous time of the Cold War. Janet Maslin of the New York Times called it, quote, a bustling, anecdotal book with a high-concept premise. That is the signature of Evan's works. He currently teaches writing at Princeton as the Ferris Professor of Journalism. He continues as a mainstay around the table on television at Inside Washington. And having dealt with Dwight Eisenhower, he's already at work on a new biography of Richard Nixon. He will be signing books immediately after his presentation. Please give him a warm welcome.
What a pleasure and an honor it is to be here at this book festival and to be introduced by the #1 political correspondent in America. No exaggeration there. In fact, you should buy his book about the 2012 campaign. Okay, Dwight Eisenhower. 6 weeks after Eisenhower became president, Stalin died. Ike called together all his top advisors and intelligence officials and said, "What's the plan?" The answer was, there is no plan. Ike blew up, not for the first or last time, and said, how could it be that the head of the Soviet Union dies and we have no idea what to do or to think about it? It was criminal, said the president. The truth was that the United States and the other Western nations had very little idea of what was going on in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. 2 years later, at the first summit meeting of the Cold War era in Geneva in July 1955, the United States still did not know who was running the Soviet Union. The Soviets sent 4 leaders. One, Bulganin, a tall man in a white suit with a white goatee who looked a lot like Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken, was nominally in charge, but clearly a figurehead. Ike hoped that the real guy in charge was General Zhukov, the head of the Red Army, who had been Ike's comrade in arms defeating the Nazis in World War II and who hated war almost as much as Ike did. Eisenhower sent his son John out to do a little spying at cocktails. John sidled up to Zhukov, who seemed subdued and shaken and would only whisper, "Things are not as they seem." President Eisenhower did not find out who was really in charge until the 5th day of the conference, when Ike proposed what he called his open skies plan. The big fear in those early days of the nuclear age was a surprise attack. So Ike proposed that each country allow the other country's reconnaissance planes to fly overhead to detect any preparations for a sneak attack. The Soviet delegation initially seemed to like the idea, but at a reception afterwards, a short, round man came straight for President Eisenhower, wagging a stubby finger and saying, "Niet, niet, niet." It was Nikita Khrushchev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the true power in the Kremlin. Open skies, said Khrushchev, was just a chance to peer into Russian bedrooms. In his diary at Geneva, British Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan wrote, "Khrushchev is a mystery. How can this fat, vulgar man with his pig eyes and ceaseless flow of talk really be the head, the aspirant czar of all these millions of people of this vast country?" Khrushchev seemed to be equal parts bluster and insecurity. To his son Sergei, he worried that he was not properly dressed for dinner at the summit, and that the plane he flew in on to Geneva was too small, smaller than the planes of the Western leaders. And yet he liked to brag and threaten. He boasted that Russian factories were cracking out rockets like sausages, and he liked to scare bourgeois capitalists, memorably saying, "We will bury you." He wanted to test the West. The testing place and the flashpoint was Berlin, the former German capital, which was 100 miles inside communist East Germany, but was still a free city protected by the Western powers. In November 1958, Khrushchev delivered an ultimatum. The West had to be out of Berlin in 6 months or else. This was a crisis, the gravest crisis yet of the Cold War. In the United States, there was a strong reaction in the press and Congress and in much of the Eisenhower administration. We need to prepare for war, it was said, to beef up our troop strength and get ready to defy the Red Army, to show our resolve. Meeting privately with his advisors and congressional leaders, President Eisenhower said, "We aren't going to do that." Indeed, he said, "We are cutting our forces in Germany by 50,000 men." His advisors and the congressmen were bewildered. Cut our troop strength? Won't that show weakness? Ike was all alone on this, and as the story leaked out, he was heavily criticized in the press, but he seemed utterly unfazed. Eisenhower had a great capacity to take responsibility. You may have seen a famous photograph taken of Ike on the eve of D-Day in June 1944. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, is in his normal uniform, and he's talking to a bunch of paratroopers who are all geared up, their faces blackened, ready to jump behind German lines in France. Ike had come to see these men because he had been told they were not likely to come back. The airborne assault at D-Day was reckoned to lose 70% of its men. Ike wanted to look these men in the eye before sending them to their fates. In his jacket pocket, he had a written note that if the landings failed, the responsibility was his alone. Eisenhower was a very confident man. He had a huge ego, but he had a good kind of confidence that you don't always see today, the confidence to be humble. He did not need to be the smartest guy in the room. Indeed, on occasion, he was willing to act dumb if it suited his purposes. As president in March of 1955, he was about to go into a press conference during a crisis with Red China, and his aides were warning him to be careful about this or that hot-button issue. "Oh, don't worry," said Ike, "I'll just confuse them." And he did. Ike often had bad syntax, but I noticed that his private letters and memos were clear as a bell. Ike was smiling and genial, but also tough. His vice president, Richard Nixon, once wrote that Ike was, quote, "a more complex and devious man than people realize." I mean devious in the best sense of the word, added Nixon. I was talking to Eisenhower's son, John, about the apparent even balance between the sunny, genial Ike and the cold-blooded Ike. John Eisenhower smiled for a moment, then said, "Make that 75% cold-blooded." When Ike was elected president, the military, the top brass, was hopeful that the new president, a former Army chief of staff, could be counted on to spend more on weapons in the military. In fact, Ike reduced military spending. He was always wary of the military hyping the threat to justify more money. He was skeptical of Pentagon estimates that the Soviet Army could overrun Europe in just 2 weeks. On one of these estimates, he wrote in the margin, "I don't believe it. Hell, it took us 2 months just to take Sicily." When the spending request came in, Ike would say, "I know those boys down at the Pentagon." Ike believed that real national security came from a sound economy. As president, he was a deficit hawk who controlled government spending and taxes. His famous speech, warning against the military-industrial complex, came at the end of his presidency, but he had in fact been working at it all along, mostly behind the scenes. "Heaven help us," he liked to say, "when we get a president who knows less about the military than I do." His approach to the military was not just about strengthening the economy or saving money. In the Berlin crisis of 1958-59, and in earlier crises over Korea and Vietnam in 1953-54, over the Formosa Straits in 1954-55, during the Suez Crisis in 1956, Eisenhower was playing a bigger game for higher stakes. As a West Point cadet and a young Army officer, Ike had been a great poker player. Indeed, he was so good that he had to give the game up. He was taking too much money away from his fellow officers, and it was hurting his career. He switched to bridge, at which he was also formidable. But he never forgot how to bluff. My book is essentially about the way Ike bluffed with nuclear weapons. As only a real warrior can, Ike hated war. Curiously, the great war hero had never actually been in combat himself. In World War I, he had been stateside training troops to his great chagrin, and by the time of World War II, he was too valuable, knew too much, to risk getting killed or captured. But he knew war. He went to a lot of battlefields and he saw the carnage. After the war, he flew in a small plane from Berlin to Moscow, over the Ukraine, following the path of first the German, then the Russian armies, where he saw not a single building left standing. He went to the concentration camps along with a tough-talking General Patton, who threw up when he saw what they found there. Ike was changed when he came home, his wife Mamie said. He was not particularly religious, but he was more spiritual. Ike wanted to be religious. He insisted on starting cabinet meetings with a prayer, but sometimes he would just plunge right in until his more pious Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, nudged him. "Jesus Christ, we forgot the prayer," Ike would exclaim. Ike's experience with war was sending thousands of young men to their deaths and ordering the firebombings of cities made him want to avoid any war. There was a lot of talk in his time and since of fighting limited wars, of gradual response, of surgical strikes. Ike wasn't having any of that. He was an all-or-nothing man. His central insight from reading Clausewitz on war and his own experience is that war is a mutating monster, that small, short wars have a way of turning into big, long wars, and that politicians and statesmen who think they can control war are kidding themselves. At the same time, Ike was no pacifist. He believed that Soviet communism was expansionist, and it was easy to see why just by looking at the map, and that you had to stand up to communists. But the way to do that was not by fighting small or limited or brushfire wars, but by threatening to go all the way, by what they called massive retaliation, all or nothing, shoot the works. This is what Ike insisted on in Berlin. With the National Security Council, he expressly used a poker analogy. The note-taker recorded the president saying, quote, "In order to avoid beginning with the white chips and working up to the blue, we should place them on notice," they were the Soviets, "that our whole stack is in play." He meant no slow escalation from white chips, conventional forces, to blue chips, nuclear bombs. Rather, the Americans would, quote, "hit the Russians as hard as we could." The Russians, quote, "will have started the war, we will finish it. That is all the policy I have." Said the president. Ike added, "This is not going to be some nice, sweet World War II kind of war." Eisenhower had great human skills. He usually refused to use the phone because he liked to meet with people face to face. With Khrushchev, he knew he had to meet him, to take his measure, to make Khrushchev his partner in avoiding world war. The issue, Ike wrote in a very smart letter to a friend in 1956, quote, "is not merely man against man or nation against nation, it is man against war." In the summer of 1959, Ike invited Khrushchev to the United States. He took Khrushchev on a helicopter flight over the Washington suburbs to see all the new houses and cars. Khrushchev pretended to see only the rush hour traffic jams, but he asked if he could buy 3 helicopters and a Boeing 707. Khrushchev was denied a trip to Disneyland, security reasons, but he did get to meet Nelson Rockefeller, with whom he pretended to shadowbox, and he was especially pleased to meet Marilyn Monroe. Ike invited Khrushchev to Camp David. "What is this Camp David?" Khrushchev asked. He was suspicious, wondering if the Americans meant to somehow kidnap him. At Camp David, Khrushchev ranted and threatened that the tanks would roll in Berlin. Ike's top aide, Andy Goodpasser, wrote "impasse" on a piece of paper. But Ike took a nap and had an idea. Ike's Gettysburg farm was close by. He called his daughter-in-law, Barbara, and told her to have her kids all spruced up and on the porch of the farmhouse in 30 minutes. He brought Khrushchev to meet them. Ike knew that Khrushchev was not suicidal. Indeed, Khrushchev was a survivor. He had survived Hitler and Stalin. The Kremlin leaders, Ike said, were not early Christian martyrs. They wanted to live too. Khrushchev was charmed and warmed by Ike's grandchildren. He too had grandchildren. The next day, after some more dickering, Khrushchev lifted his ultimatum on Berlin. The crisis passed. Of course, it was not the end of the Cold War or the end of crises. Eisenhower was a great leader, a great president, I think, but he was not perfect. He made mistakes. One of them was trusting the CIA too much. In May 1960, on the eve of a summit conference in Paris that Ike hoped would be the beginning of true détente with the Soviet Union, the CIA's spy plane, the U-2, was shot down over Russia. The CIA had suppressed a study showing that Soviet anti-aircraft missiles could now climb high enough to reach the U-2 and led Ike to believe that the pilot would never be captured, that he would die when the plane broke up or kill himself with a suicide pill. The Russians captured the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, and Khrushchev gloated and ranted about wicked American spies. That was the end of the summit conference. Eisenhower was very depressed. "I want to resign," he said to his faithful assistant, Ann Whitman, when he came into the Oval Office after Powers was captured and his cover story blown. Ike bounced back, he always did, but in truth, after nearly 8 years of constant tension, he was exhausted. Ike threatened to use nuclear weapons in various crises. Indeed, he once compared them to bullets, but he never told anyone whether he would actually use them. He could not, of course, or his threat would no longer be credible. Talk about the loneliness of command. Of course, Ike knew all about that. From the North African campaign in 1943 to D-Day to the conquest of Germany and the liberation of Europe. Ike smoked 4 packs a day as a general. He quit cold turkey in 1949. "I gave myself an order to quit," he said. Ike was pretty beat up by 1960. He had a major heart attack in 1955, an intestinal operation in 1956, small stroke in 1957. His doctors worried about his high blood pressure. They were always ordering him to worry less. "Just what do they think this job is?" he said. He tried to relax by playing golf. He played 800 times as president, 200 times at Augusta in Georgia. But golf was maybe the wrong game for a perfectionist. Ike could be pretty grim on the course, and he once threw a golf club, his sand wedge, at his doctor, Howard Snyder, when Snyder tried to make him feel better after muffing a shot out of the bunker. Ike had a huge temper, which he kept hidden from the public, but not from his aides. Ike's mother was a fundamentalist Christian who would read scripture to Ike. "He who conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh the city," she told the future conqueror. "My mother taught me to hold my temper," Ike told his aides. "I thought to myself, what a poor job she had done," recalled one aide. "When he was mad, it was like peering into a Bessemer steel furnace," said another aide. "He had trouble sleeping, and towards the end, he was taking too many sleeping pills and maybe an extra drink or two." Ike was worn out by the end, and he looked it. The Kennedy people made the most of the contrast. Ike, the old golf-playing grandfather, a little out of it, caretaker, versus JFK, young, handsome, vigorous, a new generation. The image stuck. Scholars have known for at least 30 years that Ike was a clever and even devious president behind the scenes. But most people still think of Ike as a kind of genial, grandfatherly presence. Well, he gave us 8 years of peace and prosperity, a claim no other 20th century president could make. After Ike got us out of Korea in 1953, by threatening to use nuclear weapons. He never sent another American soldier into combat over the next 8 years. If the 1950s seem a little boring in retrospect, it was partly because Ike made them that way. Ike was a proud man, but he was also modest. When he was asked how he wanted to be memorialized, he answered, "Just don't let them put me on a horse." But he was proud that in his time, America was strong and at peace. By God, he once said, "It didn't just happen." Thank you very much. Sir.
Evan, you brought out the really strong points of Eisenhower, and I was a great admirer of him. But there was one incident. He had a friend who he made Supreme Court Chief Justice, and when Brown versus Topeka was there, he went on record for insulting this decision and whatever. Was that a play that he was doing, or what was going on in his mind?
Eisenhower's record on civil rights is controversial. There was a perception, even in his own staff, that he moved a little slow. And he did say, not publicly, but he said privately that he regretted appointing Earl Warren, and that, of course, got out. And so this remains to this day a subject of controversy. But Eisenhower, as I mentioned, operated by a hidden hand. You had to watch a little bit, not just what he said, but what he did. And Eisenhower, as president, desegregated the armed forces. Yes, it was Harry Truman who first gave the order, but the guy who made it happen was Eisenhower. Eisenhower desegregated Washington, D.C. Eisenhower appointed the federal judges who desegregated the South. Eisenhower introduced the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first Civil Rights Act. And when a Southern governor in Arkansas defied the federal courts and refused to allow the integration of Little Rock High School, Eisenhower didn't kid around. He sent the 101st Airborne to make it happen. So Eisenhower was more active on civil rights than I think we realize today. And I think actually historians are coming to see that and to write it. He was a gradualist. He was. He was not a bomb thrower. He was a low-key guy. He preferred to operate behind the scenes. But he did act, and he did bring the country down a road it had to go.
Thank you.
Sir.
Yeah, thank you for a great book. I just want to find out, have you worked at all with Eisenhower Memorial or John Eisenhower or David Eisenhower? Because I know they have, obviously a lot of anecdotal.
Obviously, there's a big controversy over the memorial. I don't know what I think about it. I have stodgy taste. I'm probably a little bit like Ike, so I'd probably I'd probably put him on a horse just like he didn't want to be. But Frank Gehry's a great architect. He has a vision. This is going to be hashed out over time. I'm sorry that it's taking so long. I'm sorry that it's causing some bad blood. I think Eisenhower deserves a memorial for all the reasons I just gave. I think in time, and this is Washington, things take time. In time, he'll get his memorial.
Have you interviewed very many people? I actually done oral history for your book.
Well, John, you mentioned John Eisenhower was incredibly helpful to me. John Eisenhower is the sole surviving son of Dwight Eisenhower. His first son, Ike, died when he was a baby. And John Eisenhower, well, can you imagine being the son of Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower? John Eisenhower begins his memoir with a sentence, "I think I was born standing at attention." And John Eisenhower, his father was loving, but remote and demanding, was always criticizing his son's deportment. There's a word you don't hear much anymore. And, as I mentioned in my speech, it was John Eisenhower who said, when we were talking about the genial Ike versus the cold-blooded Ike, it was John who said, make that 75% cold-blooded. But the great thing was that John, unlike a lot of sons, was willing to really think about his father, really consider him to be as objective as a son can be about his father, and spent several hours with me and my wife, Osi, just trying to figure out Dad. And I'm eternally grateful. Very unusual to find a son who is quite so open and reflective about his father.
Thank you.
Sir.
Yeah, from what I've read, there's a paradox about Eisenhower maybe you could answer. As you point out in your book, while he was president, he was very cautious and prudent statesman. But then when he left the presidency, the advice that he gave to John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson was a lot more aggressive.
Yes, I think the question is, was he more aggressive in his advice to Johnson and Kennedy? Maybe a little bit, but I studied that because I had the same kind of question. How do you reconcile the two? I think if you look closely at the record, what he was really saying to Kennedy and Johnson was his basic theme, which is if you're going to do this, go all the way. He said in Vietnam, if you're going to go into Vietnam, declare war, mine the harbors, invade, don't do it halfway. He believed that politicians, almost by definition, believe in compromise and half measures, gradual escalation. He thought that was the wrong way to go. And privately, he said that several times to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson used him. Johnson was a great political manipulator, of course, would trot Eisenhower out, knowing that former President Eisenhower was going to support the president, support the office. So Eisenhower backed Johnson all the way. But privately, LBJ was hearing a different signal from Eisenhower, and that was, if you're going to do this, and he was explicit about it, go all the way or don't do it, which is what, in Eisenhower's time, he didn't do it. But he always had this view of if you're going to be serious about your threats, but if you're going to do it, do it.
Well, how do you explain when he handed the baton over to John Kennedy, he told him that Laos was the biggest danger in the world?
But if you really look at that conversation, Kennedy and Eisenhower met at the White House. And if you look, there are various memos of understanding. The one you're referring to is written by Kennedy's own people. They wanted to get Eisenhower on the record saying use force. But if you look at the Eisenhower Memorandum of Understanding, it's much more elliptical. And what he's really saying is you got to play poker, using that old poker analogy. You got to bluff the Russians, but that's not the same thing as going in. You got to be willing to threaten in a serious way, but not to go in.
Thank you.
Let's see, other side, I'm sorry.
One of the crises with the Soviets was the invasion of Hungary. Can you describe what Eisenhower did behind the scenes and whether he was happy with how it turned out or whether he should have done it differently?
Eisenhower was cursed, if you will, by two simultaneous crises in October 1956. At the very same time, the Soviet Union was invading Hungary, putting down a revolution, actually a real revolution there, and at the same time, Great Britain and France and Israel were invading Egypt, hoping to recapture the Sinai Peninsula and recapture the Suez Canal, which had been seized by Nasser of Egypt. And Eisenhower had to deal with both of those at once. Now, on Hungary, he knew that there was no way in hell we were going to go into Hungary. Hungary's landlocked. We had no forces. We couldn't get there. It would have been a joke. So we basically did nothing on Hungary. That was painful, certainly painful as hell to the Hungarians, who believed, with some evidence, that the CIA had encouraged them to revolt. Historians are still arguing about this today, how much encouragement the CIA gave the Hungarians, but some encouragement. So it was a terrible blow to the freedom forces in Hungary. But Eisenhower, who's an extreme realist and a pragmatist and who understood ground forces and invasions, knew from the outset there was nothing that we could do to save the Hungarians in that revolution. However, at the same time, he is stopping Great Britain and France and Israel stopping them in their tracks in their invasion, because he's fearful that a Middle East war is going to get out of control and the Russians are going to intervene and you're going to have a world war. And he does, American power was maybe a little greater in those days. He's able to stop Great Britain by typical Eisenhower, quietly sending a signal that the United States is going to start a run on the pound, and when the British come to the United States asking for oil, because with the canal closed, it meant no oil coming to Great Britain, as Eisenhower put it, Great Britain could boil in its own oil. He wasn't going to give them any oil. That was that. That was the end of the invasion. Those countries came to heel. I don't think an American president has that kind of power today, but in 1956, Eisenhower was able to do that and to be fairly ruthless about it.
I'd like to change gear a little bit and talk about domestic. During Eisenhower's presidency, we were caught in the throes of McCarthyism. My understanding that Eisenhower certainly did not do very much to that threat, and in addition, Marshall, who really made Eisenhower to a great degree, who was attacked by McCarthy, that he received no support from Eisenhower.
Yep. There's a terrible story which makes Eisenhower supporters cringe, including his own aides, including his own secretary. And that is in the presidential campaign in 1952, in October 1952, a couple weeks before the election, Eisenhower is campaigning in Wisconsin, and you remember Joe McCarthy, Tail Gunner Joe, the great demagogue. McCarthy has been saying insulting things about General Marshall, of all people, saying that General Marshall, the great Army Chief of Staff in World War II, is a traitor. I mean, just wildly reckless allegation. And Eisenhower writes into a speech a defense of General Marshall, who, after all, had promoted Eisenhower, had really discovered Eisenhower. And right before he's supposed to give this speech, Eisenhower takes that paragraph out of the speech. Why? Because they're in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home state. They don't want to offend McCarthy, and Wisconsin is deemed to be a critical state in the election. Bad moment of political expediency for Dwight Eisenhower. And as I said, his own staff was upset about this. But again, with Eisenhower, you got to take the long view. And Eisenhower's view on McCarthy was this. He would say, I'm not going to get into a pissing contest with a skunk. I'm not going to get down in the gutter with that guy. If I take him on directly, it's going to cause a huge fight in the Republican Party between the moderate wing. In those days, the Republican Party actually had a moderate wing, and the right wing, and it's going to cause all this internal dissension, and it will distract from what we're trying to do. But, he said, McCarthy will hang himself. And sure enough, McCarthy did hang himself. Now, it took 15 months. And in those 15 months, McCarthy continued to do damage. He continued to make unwarranted claims. He continued to hurt people who were innocent. But Eisenhower who was a deeply patient man, one of Eisenhower's qualities, born of war and being a Supreme Allied commander, was to be patient. And sure enough, McCarthy made the mistake of attacking the U.S. Army, and Eisenhower was waiting for him, and by a series of behind-the-scenes maneuvers, denying McCarthy various material, actually invoking executive privilege for the first time, they created a situation in which McCarthy did hang himself, self-destructed in the Army McCarthy hearings in 1954. And Eisenhower came to a cabinet meeting and said, have you heard the latest? McCarthyism is McCarthy-wasism. And he was right.
I came in late, so no need repeating if you covered this. Did Ice Bluff lead directly to the mutual assured destruction policy later on?
Yes, mutual assured destruction, as you know, is the principle by which each side knows the other has enough force to destroy them. So you have no incentive to attack because you, in turn, will be destroyed. That was slowly evolving. They didn't call it that, but they were working towards that. Eisenhower's strategy, really, in his day, was just a Sunday punch, to have the power to destroy the Soviet Union and to make sure the Soviet Union knew that. Now, the Soviet Union was building its own forces and getting towards the day that there would be mutually assured destruction. But in Eisenhower's time, really the Americans had the advantage. This is confusing. Some of you may remember the missile gap and the bomber gap. The politics of that era and the, I should say, irresponsible press of that era created this myth that the Soviets were ahead because of Sputnik. You all remember Sputnik in 1956. The Russians launched the first satellite, and all of a sudden the whole country was, oh my God, the Russians have big rockets, they can destroy us. Eisenhower, in his typical low-key, cool way, sort of let this bubble along because he knew we were actually way ahead of the Russians. Our missiles were more accurate, they were more deadly, we were building them faster, and most importantly, we were putting missiles on submarines that were invulnerable. So the Polaris submarine was coming along and creating a force that was invincible. Now, as the Russians did eventually, by the 1960s, build a similar force, and that's what gave us MAD. So he was a stop on the road to MAD, but he wasn't quite there yet.
Thanks very much for your talk, and I think maybe you just answered my question, which was Ike bluffing? Was he ready to go nuclear over Berlin, and for that matter, over Korea? It was a stalemate in Korea. Nobody hardly was dying. Was he ready to go nuclear over that?
Yes, you know, Scott, was Ike bluffing? Scholars have spent a lot of time trying to tease out the answer to this. And the amazing thing about Ike, and that I find so interesting about it, in fact, this is really how I got to write this book. I was having lunch with somebody who said, you know, Ike never told his closest assistant, General Goodpaster, whether he would use nuclear weapons or not. And I thought, really? Think of that. You never tell even your closest national security advisor whether you're going to use these things? Think about the loneliness of command. Think of that. And I was reading a book by McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor to John F. Kennedy, about nuclear strategy. And in 1961, young JFK has just been elected president, talking about the missile gap and threatening actually to use nuclear weapons in a limited way. And Berlin's erupted into another crisis. And young President Kennedy doesn't know what to do, and he brings in Dean Acheson, the old Secretary of State Dean Acheson, tough, cold warrior. And I think they think that Acheson's going to say, come on, Mr. President, don't be a wimp, lean on the Russians. What Acheson says, Kennedy says to Acheson, how do you know when to use nuclear weapons? And Acheson thinks for a second, and he says, well, if I were you, Mr. President, I would think for a long time, and I would never tell anyone. Think about this. Tell no one. The job of the President of the United States at that time was never to reveal when you were going to actually use these weapons. You had to bluff, you had to threaten, you had to have the capacity to do it, and the apparent willingness to do it, but you could never tell anybody whether you actually would use them and under what circumstances. And that was really what I did. It was a bit of an education for John F. Kennedy.
So we don't know.
So we don't know. Yes. Well, let me just finish that thought. I think actually, possibly in 1953, when we had an absolute dominance, had the Soviets and the North Koreans restarted the Korean War, I think the evidence suggests that Eisenhower would have been willing to use nuclear weapons at that time. I think that's a guess, but that's as close as best I can do. Sir.
Hi. My question actually does not apply to the period that your book is focused on.
It's okay.
I don't think, but I'm curious. I'm curious about relationship, professional or otherwise, with General MacArthur.
Yeah. Eisenhower, when he was a colonel, was chief of staff, major than a colonel, was chief of staff to the great General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur. And Eisenhower always said he learned what not to do by studying MacArthur. What did he mean by that? Obviously, MacArthur was a military genius, but he was vainglorious. He was very proud. He took credit for everything himself that he possibly could. Eisenhower studied that and went the exact opposite way. Eisenhower gave credit to others. He was low-key. He was genial and smiling. He concealed. Eisenhower once said, "I got ahead by concealing my ambition and my intelligence." The opposite of the great MacArthur. MacArthur was a little condescending to Ike. He called him the best clerk he'd ever had. So there was no love there. And when MacArthur was sacked by Harry Truman for disobedience in the Korean War, Ike quietly said, yes.
Thank you. I understand that in 1953, Eisenhower approved the involvement of CIA in overthrowing Mossadegh.
Yes.
Is that true? And if yes, how does it fit in the profile of Ike you are describing? Right. Thank you.
Among Eisenhower's mistakes was giving the CIA too much authority to conduct covert operations, including the overthrows of governments in Iran in 1953, as said, and Guatemala the next year in 1954. Now, at the time, it's important writing history to look at things not necessarily as they appear now, but as they appear at the time. It was a little more understandable. Eisenhower, as a military man, was desirous of not using conventional forces because he knew that in battle what can go wrong will go wrong. He did not have the politician's view that you can do some quickie surgical strike, some limited action, and it would all be over, the war would be over quickly. He knew that wars have a way of getting out of control. That's what he got out of reading Clausewitz, that wars are a mutating monster. So he was desirous of not using conventional forces. He couldn't really use nuclear forces. He threatened with them, but he sure as hell didn't want to have a nuclear war. Well, what does that leave? It leaves covert operations. And the hope in the 1950s was that the CIA and the intelligence community could run cheap, secret, deniable operations against communist expansionism, and they, in fact, did this successfully. I put successfully in quotes because it seemed successful at the time, first in Iran, overthrowing this left-leaning Mossadegh and installing a Shah of Iran, and then in Guatemala, overthrowing the Arbenz regime, which was deemed to be left-leaning. At the time, they gave out secret medals. It looked like a great idea. Now, of course, we know it led to decades of misrule in Guatemala, and in Iran, it produced the Iran that we have today, that is still blaming the CIA for every plot and for having installed the Shah, and you know that whole tortured history. So, in retrospect, these covert operations were a mistake, but in the context of the time, they were at least understandable. Sir.
It seems like a theme of Eisenhower's life has been confronting, superpowers like Germany and the Soviet Union with vast military might of our own. And, in light of that record and the failure of the covert operations you just described, what relevance, does his way of thinking, his foreign policy have, in dealing with the kind of instability we're seeing in the Middle East with all these stateless terrorism groups?
This is a fascinating question. What would Eisenhower do today? You're not dealing with states, you're dealing with these stateless groups. My guess, and of course it's only a guess, is that his bias would be against mission creep, would be against temporary involvements or limited involvements that could suck us into a bigger war. He would not want to do that. He would have been very hesitant to get involved in Libya, Syria, you name it. Now, at the same time, I think he would have been willing to use massive force if it was absolutely necessary. For instance, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, and they clearly are getting one or have one, I think that Eisenhower probably would be willing to run a strike to take out the Iranians, to take out the Iranian bomb. But he would do that so reluctantly, and only after the most active diplomacy and, I think, covert action. I think that were Ike president, the NSA and the CIA would be working overtime to stop Iran from getting a bomb. Actually, I think the NSA and CIA are working overtime to stop that bomb. They're working with Mossad, even killing Iranian scientists. I always mispronounce this word, Stuxnet, that bug that they put into the Iranian centrifuges. I'm reasonably sure that our intelligence community is doing all sorts of covert stuff against the Iranian bomb project right now. Eisenhower would want to do that. He'd be concerned that it backfire. He'd be anxious about it, but being president is anxiety-making, and it's a terrible responsibility. And obviously, you have to feel for President Obama or any chief executive who confronts these incredibly difficult problems that have no easy or clear solution.
Good afternoon, sir. I was doing some research on President Eisenhower, and I researched on his mother, and I saw her, and I read other things about him, and there was a lot of rumors that he was mixed and that he was passing. I found that very interesting. And how do you think he would deal with that rumor?
It's a rumor. I don't. There's no evidence to support it. Eisenhower lived in a different age. Today with CNN and the internet, and you got to respond. In fact, you have all these consultants around you saying, "Oh my God, you can't let another minute pass without going onto TV and responding." In 1955, there was no internet. There was no CNN. It was easier just to shut up and say nothing. And Eisenhower was very patient, as I said, didn't need to show off. He had this kind of quiet confidence. Eisenhower really didn't have anything to prove. He'd been Allied Supreme Commander. He'd conquered Europe. I mean, really, what did he have left to prove? So Eisenhower, my guess is, and well, I don't have to guess because he said nothing about it. Now, again, it's the age in which he lived. He could say nothing. In a modern environment where this is kind of lighting up the internet, maybe he would have to say something. But I'm sure he'd avoid it. He'd avoid dignifying that rumor with an answer because I'm quite sure it's not true, and so he would not wish to keep it going.
Well, I think that worked in his case.
It did. Yeah. Well, if you could
Thank
do
you.
it, if you could say nothing, it's a good thing to do. It's just, in the modern age, hard to do.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.